We've got Bucky Whitehouse today. He's going to be speaking to us about the Firestorm. That was a big news item, and we're going to get the deets on that. Bucky's bio is in your program. For those of you who didn't get a program, they're at the front registration desk. I was going to give you a page number for his bio so you could read all the details, but it doesn't have page numbers. I think that must have been extra. Anyway, Bucky has been involved in emergency services for 2 decades. 2 decades. He's got a lot of credentials, a lot of experience. But I got to tell you, the Bucky Whitehouse was voted as the Citizen of the Year in Tooele. Woohoo!
All right, who planted that? Who told
I
you
think
about
that speaks to Bucky and what he does for his community. I think that's great. So let's give him a welcome round of applause, and we'll turn it back over to Bucky.
Can you guys hear me with this mic, or do I need to go? Is this one better? Okay. Don't go put your hand in my pocket. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thanks, Chris, for the introduction. I'm Bucky Whitehouse. I'm the emergency manager out in Tooele. And Chris kind of let out the cat out of the bag a little bit in terms of a recent acknowledgement I got from my peers in Tooele County. I very much appreciate the award. It's a very gratifying award to receive in your own local community. I'm going to take the opportunity to embarrass my staff, though, while I have the opportunity. If they would just raise their arms for me up in the air. Anytime you get an award like Person of the Year award, it means 2 things. Number one, it means you had a lot, at least in our profession, means you probably had a lot of bad things happen, you know, that you were involved with in one direction or another. And secondly to that, you had a good staff, and you had a good team that you were working with. And in my case, I had an excellent team that I was working with. I used this saying before, very much consider myself to be a reflection of great teams that I work with out in the Tooele area. So I am by trade actually probably the epitome of jack of all trades, master of none. I've been in public health, I've been in industrial hygiene, I've been in emergency management, I've been in public safety for, as Chris mentioned, right around 2 decades. And it's been a very rewarding experience to be involved, you know, in all of those different arenas, but I really have the passion that I think I was cut out to be in right now in emergency management. One unique thing I have going for me is that I wear 2 hats. Actually, I wear multiple hats. I'm the fire chief out in Tooele, in addition to being the emergency manager for the county. And so with that being said, I have kind of an interesting time, and kind of the preface by which I want to talk today is kind of how is it possible, or how do you go about wearing an incident commander's hat? How do you transfer that into the emergency manager's hat? When are they similar? When are they different? And then I want to convey it kind of underneath the context of this large event that I'm sure you have all seen and heard something about, the firestorm that we had out in Tooele. Now, from a firefighter's side, one of the legacies that you never want to have is losing 10 houses in one fire, okay? And even though that was, and I think I coined the catchphrase out there at the time, a catastrophic fire, because it was, we had a lot of really neat, a lot of really resilient examples of how communities can come together, especially small communities, in order to be able to handle such a problem like this. My first slide, 2016, in all my career, almost 20 years, or right around 20 years, I had somebody ask me the other day, well, how does 2016 rate in terms of all of the emergency events you've ever dealt with? And without question, it is number 1, okay? For whatever reason, and a lot of the counterparts in the EM world like to tease me and tease anyone from Tooele about all the strange things that occur in Tooele. And 2016 was very much an example of how strange it can get, okay? Just a little example for you. Tooele, obviously, we have winds. We live out in the West Desert. We experience large-scale winds. Our year started in February of 2016, where we had a lot of, wind damage related to trees and power lines and trampolines and power lines, that sort of thing. We had our Firestorm, which is what we're here to kind of talk about today. We've had transportation incidents. We've had power and electrical problems. If I raise a hand, do I have anybody in the room that has ever heard of a train taking out 27 power poles all in one setting? Kind of a unique one, right? Yeah, my staff is raising their hands. Yeah, that was the first time for them as well. Yeah, and then we've had some evacuations. Just a couple of photos for you to tell you how silly our year went, or how wild, probably the better way to say it, our year was. On the left, you've got the power line outages. Again, we had winds that caused our power lines to, in this particular area of Erta, Bates Canyon, come down across a railroad track. And a passing through train came through, snagged that line, and it took a mile before the train could stop. And so in the context or the process of the train getting stopped, it snapped 27 large power poles just right off. And obviously, we had power outages in the area. The one that you see on the right was another one of our big events out there, where we had I-80 closed for 14 hours in the Tooele area. I-80, it's not until you go through an experience like that that you understand just how much traffic, whether it's I-80 or I-15, is actually on one of the larger roads like that. This is a military vehicle. This is a military vehicle that had fallen off the back of a flatbed truck into the middle of the roadway, and unfortunately we had some cars crash into this and at any rate caused the interstate to be taken down for a period of time. Before I get going, I'm a very interactive speaker. Anytime I get invited to speak, I don't like to stand up and drone on too long, and I'm going to try to move around a little bit, and hopefully I don't see a lot of necks, people breaking their necks, turning around, looking at me, but I do like to kind of wander, kind of roam around a little bit, in part because I like to see if you all have questions. So at any time, as I'm presenting today, if you have questions, if I'm not covering something clearly, please stand up, raise your hand. Chris is here with me, kind of co-piloting right now. He'll bring the microphone around if I can't get around to you. Let us know what your questions are. One of the things that I really want to impress upon you is, even though you know how emergencies are supposed to go, and I bet you all can testify this if you've ever had the opportunity, they're also different, especially in our world today. They're different to the point where it's amazing what happens. And so anyway, before I get going, by raise of hands, how many emergency managers do I have in the room? Okay. What are some of the others? How many students do I have? Awesome. Okay. Just public safety in general that's here? Okay. That gives me a little bit of a feel. Okay. How many of you have ever been in an incident command role, emergency managers? Good. That's a fair portion of you, so I'm happy to hear about that. How many of you have ever had, and this is a little bit of context about my 2016 year, how many of you have ever had to skip or delay the start of a vacation due to an incident? Incidents happen. That's a fair number as well. Okay. Incidents don't happen when we want them to all the time, right? So we all probably acknowledge that, not unusual. How many of you have ever been dealing with one of these incidents and had a moment like that when you have asked that question? Well, because of 2016 and what that did for us out in Tooele, I have since been given one of these buttons that goes on my desk. Occasionally it ends up in my vehicle. And anytime I have an unusual situation, I get to slam on it. Got it turned off. Or maybe that's a good sign. So it sings to me, kind of enlightens my day a little bit. WTF. That was kind of how our year went. So a little bit of a preface. You might not be able to see that well, but what we're here to talk about today is the large fire, what we know as and what we call the Firestorm in Tooele City. It was our 60 to 100 year fire. We have not seen anything like this in quite some time. It was on July 19th at approximately 10:42 p.m. I want to go through just a little bit of video to give it some more context for you.
I need you down in this trailer park. We have a couple of structures that are involved as well as grass fires as well. I think we're good for water, but we could really use some manpower.
Is my family okay?
I have never seen a fire involve this many houses this quickly.
Does anyone need help? I was up by the church and we saw like this orange, and we were coming to check on our family, and that's when it like took off and spread through the field.
It hadn't quite reached the fence line and come into the field immediately, but the whole field was involved and it was approaching the houses on Van Dyke.
I need manpower more than anything.
And then it started catching these houses on fire, and that's when the explosions started happening.
We had some issues with gas lines that were exposed and were active fire. We also had issues with transformers that blew for power.
There's a structure fire on Coleman and about 680. Copy that. If you're available, I need to have you head there.
And it didn't take it very long to involve every single one of those houses, including the house just kitty corner across here, which it went up just in seconds, and it was gone. There was nothing left of it within 15, 20 minutes.
Winds and weather obviously played a huge factor in what happened tonight. The fire load was pretty high with the grasses and the brush in between the neighborhoods and in between the homes. A lot of that debris was burning, so it was causing issues for us to be able to contain the fire because with those winds, the sustained 20, 30 mile an hour winds and higher gusts, those debris piles just burn so rapidly, and we were putting water on it and it was burning faster than we could put water on it.
Copy that. 2 grants for firefighters headed to the hospital.
We had a couple of firefighters that were transported to Mountain West Medical Center for injuries. Unaware of the extent of those injuries at this time.
It's my grandma and grandpa's home. They moved here in 75.
My grandpa got up to pick up the phone and answered it and stood out his back window, and at the same time he's seen the tree on fire. The neighbor said, it's right behind you, get out. And so my grandpa yelled through the living room to my grandma, get your shoes and go out the front door, and they made it out just in time.
Everybody is positive, no loss of life, which is the main thing. I don't even think anybody lost any animals. God was watching over us, that everybody tried to do their part and watch out for their neighbors and tried to get everybody out safely and tried to stay in battle with fire as long as we could.
I'm just glad that they still are here and they have each other, because everything can be replaced, people can't.
A little bit of a context about how quick the event moved. In fact, you're probably going to hear me today talk a lot about emergencies, and I'm sure many of you that have been in the field for a while now are going to really relate to me when I tell you emergencies are really driven by the speed of the event, right? Some are a little slower, some give us a little more time to do things. Others require us to act and react, combined with the fact that if you're from a small town, small area, like many of us in the room are, the number of hats that you wear can get real complicated at times. If you're the EM and you're an officer, or if you're the EM and you're the fire chief, like in my case, sometimes, where's the line between your incident command duties versus where do your emergency manager's duties pick up? Okay, so we're going to be going through that. I'm going to give you a little bit of an agenda, tell you a little bit about kind of how I'm going to address this because of the length. This event is actually still ongoing. We're still in a recovery mode out in the Tooele area just from this specific event. But how I just chose to kind of break this down for you today, just because the size of the fire, magnitude of the fire, and the variables involved with it, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the fire dynamics, tell you about how great our public utility system was out in the Tooele area at the time, in part because of how quickly they were able to get there and what they were able to do for us. Talk about the scene, because again, it's got some dynamics that I think will help lend you, for you to be able to understand what we had. Evacuations, the media. Is Joe in the room? Any PIOs in the room? The media in and of itself, and or social media for us out in the Tooele area, was very difficult, again, because of the speed of the event combined with the multiple hats that many of us were wearing. Also, from there, we're going to go into the recovery challenges, damage assessments, debris removals, kind of the volunteer coordination side of the things, and then how is the Tooele community rebuilding? because it is a process, and it's one that I think sometimes, actually frequently, gets forgotten. What recovery means, what rebuilding means, and how that affects the different people, okay? Raise your hands. Anybody been in Twilla before? That's better. I've got some people that thought life ended at Saltaire and didn't realize. Occasionally they were out, oh yeah, I guess I've been in Wendover, but as far as I know, or they thought it ended at Saltaire. But our commercials that we have by one of our recreational dealers out there, 300 miles out, but only 30 miles back. We're not too far away. We have a really valuable relationship with Unified Fire Authority, many of the different agencies in the Salt Lake Valley, because we share in resources and we appreciate it. Twilla City, just real quick, for any of you that may not know where Twilla is. It's a town is a population of about 33,000 people, more or less a rural area, extends over a fairly significant number of miles, in part because it borders one of the military installations, Twilla Army Depot out in the area. It's kind of got a mixture of urban and rural, mixture of neighborhoods, open space, urban space. It's got a few urban interface zones, some undeveloped zones. Here's kind of a quick map for you, aerial map that was obviously, the town was really popular right after the fire occurred because it's so hard to fathom how it happened, what happened with it. It's serviced by approximately 13 fire departments, 10 of which are volunteer. The departments range, in terms of response, range anywhere from 50 to 800, depending upon the location that they sit in the Twilla Valley. So a little bit of demographics about that. When this fire began, okay, it was 10:42, July 19th. Obviously, it's a date that I will never forget. It was a call of a grass fire reported at 700 South and what we call Coleman Street in the Twilla area. We actually had 3 callers on it. One just called, said, there's a grass fire, and we'd been struggling with grass fires in the area at that point in time. This is obviously post 4th of July, so it was no stranger. We were starting to see our dry time begin out there. We did have a caller that called and said that they had heard popping and a fire had begun out in the field. And what you saw there in the video, people saw the fire out in the field. It was usually, in their case, in their backyard, but it was moving, and they just had to get out of the area in a hurry. The witnesses, we had a third caller, probably most importantly, where witness observed an individual intentionally lighting the fire. They were driving by the area on their way home and saw what they thought was an individual that had been lighting the fire on that corner of 700 South and Coleman. A little bit more about the fire dynamics and how this worked. For a fire operation, or for a fire response, it was really a pretty rapid one. The call came in at 10:42. By 10:45, we had our first chief officer on scene, believe it or not. Within 5 minutes of that initial page, we had our first unit on scene. And then within 9 minutes, we had our first house fully involved, which is pretty unheard of, and then subsequently it gets pushed and spread accordingly. Before we know it, that's what we've got, kind of that initial slide that I had just referred to. It was such a scenario where you can see the large deck guns pushing the water out into the air. There's a quick picture for you from 700 South and Coleman. Okay, pretty much all, and that's the intersection or the area that I responded to. My other chief officer was around on the Van Dyke side that we'll show you here in just a second. But so within that 5 to 9 minute range, we actually went from what you see there to a big fireball that was basically rolling from south to north. Obviously taking up any kind of structure, any kind of, basically anything that was in its way as it moved through. Ending up in Van Dyke, on the Van Dyke Way. These are actually firefighters that you can see kind of silhouetted right here. One thing, I've had some accolades given to me, and obviously we've had an active year, but the fire agencies out in the Twilla area that responded to this fire did an absolutely awesome job. Talk about putting yourself in harm's way of something like this with winds that were pushing at about 27 to 30-ish miles per hour. It would have been hard to deal with by any stretch. These are just some photos, individual choosing with the fire coming at them like that to stand out and try to wet down their metal building. So kind of a complicated incident, one that, I think the pictures probably tell the best story about how things went. a couple firefighters there. So as I arrive on scene, one of the first things I do after I find my red WTF button is I start requesting additional resources, okay? From start to finish, we ended up having a response from just about every fire department in the entire county because of the speed by which this was moving. Every police agency was on scene because we had approximately 40 homes that we were looking to try to evacuate. Obviously, we had medical-related issues. The emergency management staff was there. Public Works, roads, and health were all key players in this particular event. Let me give you a little bit better idea as to how this looked, okay? Fire starts down here, point of origin, corner of 700 South. At this point, you know, the reasons why or how it started, we weren't as concerned with. The fire was being driven by 27-mile-an-hour winds with 82-degree temperatures, medium to light fuels, okay? That fire burned through that field in 90 seconds with those conditions. Some of our wildland fire folks came through and helped us to understand just what we were dealing with related to the fire. It was on top of those houses before we could do much about it. Here's kind of a startling number for us, and this is why we consider it to be such a rare occurrence. The fire, if it's left unchecked, would have burned 12 and a half miles in an hour. So if that gives you any idea as to the type of winds that we were dealing with, the type of wind gusts that we were experiencing at the same time. Anytime you have a fire that is throwing 36 and a half feet flame fronts, just because of the types of gusts and types of fuels all combined together, it puts out quite a big problem, okay? It leaves, obviously, a lot to have happened and to deal with, okay? Let me tell you a little bit about what the responders were also seeing as they were getting there. We call it fire ground dynamics. We had a lot of large trees as well, and we had a big ditch that caused, in most cases, these houses to be involved. It wasn't necessarily the houses that burned quite as fast as it was all of the vegetation that was surrounding down there. So, okay, painted the picture for you. What were some of our challenges? For those of you that are in the first response community, and for any of you that saw any type of news media related to the challenges with the fire, it was a little bit unheard of. Like I mentioned, we had 4 engines in a 2-block area that were competing for the same source of water. We had 10 units within kind of an expanded area that had to deal with this, primarily the same issue, where they were dealing with a shortage of water because we only had one water supply coming in and out of the area. So as I'm there, we're starting to deploy our resources out into the fire ground, and what we've got is just a quick picture here to let you see kind of where we were at. We had engines, we had units. Our water line, actually, you'll follow the green dot for me, comes down somewhere in this area here. So we had some challenges related to water supply. That's acknowledged from the beginning, but from our perspective, we don't know how we would have done it any different, just because this was such a large, catastrophic type event where it was very difficult for us to respond to. We actually ended up, we had trucks that were connected in line back here trying to stop the fire from spreading from this side of the road to the opposite side of the road, keeping it kind of at bay where it is. For our purposes in the Tooele area, we feel like we had a California-type wildfire in the middle of Tooele City, because this is primarily an urban area of Tooele. It just so happened we've got a 13-acre field that you see here, and due to the winds, it was pushing and drove the fire rather quickly in the wrong direction. Question? This one? Excellent.
What about the house right in the middle made it so that it didn't burn?
You know what? The fire officials on scene, we have our theories, but we're only calling them theories right now. I'm glad you pointed that out. This particular house right here was not burned. And for whatever reason, it was not burned. Now, granted, it did have some barriers that were around it. It had a block concrete wall that was around it. It had open space that was around it as well. So we did have some barriers there. But as hard as the winds were blowing, and I think if you'll recall back to that video that we looked at, you saw the firefighter just sitting on his hose line, spraying water out into the field. Did you see how fast the wind was blowing by? And combined kind of with the pictures that we put up for you, winds were just unbelievable at this point in time. And so, you know, we can, I guess, theorize as to why that house was left unburned. But at this point, you know, we don't exactly know. The fire, the origin of the fire, as the previous slide said, was pushing this way and this way. And that particular house was saved. In fact, that was the only house in that particular area. We actually had houses that were further down the street. Just one on this next street. Map doesn't quite do it justice, but then we did have one across the road from that actually caught on fire. For any of you that are familiar with wildland fires, it's not uncommon to have ash and ember fly miles. Yeah, and in this case, the house that was on the adjacent street actually had the windows open that night and had ash and embers fly inside the windows, and the house basically started on fire from the inside out just because of all the debris that was flying around. So, really interesting event. What you can see here is, the stars are kind of the incident command structures where they were at. I actually happened to be down here, this star and further past down here. I actually had chief officers, command level officers down at these other different points of origin. Well, I guess the startling thing, the thing that you need to understand is for a small town, this was a big event, just from the standpoint that we had 9 agencies, and I'll reference this, go into this in just a second. It takes a little bit of time to get all of this set up. And it's probably fair to say for any department, it takes some time to get that set up. But anyway, complex issue. The yellow triangles, these were our staging points. These are actually fire units that were throughout the scene. But again, water sources were an issue for us. A little bit of an idea for you how that looked. The tank that was as close to anything, and you can probably see the emergency management kind of overlap on this from this perspective. The water tank in that particular area was a 2 million gallon water tank, and in the first hour, actually about 90 minutes, it was dropped 4 feet because there was just that amount of water being used to put out this fire. It actually broke. Our modern engines, for any firefighters in the room, have the ability basically just to suck water out of the ground, and in this case, they were doing that. They had actually cavitated some water lines, just in part because we had such a large demand in that particular 2-block area. So, if you come back to this particular unit, your water line comes in right here. If you're this engine right here, you got all the water that you need. If you're one of these engines down here, you have a really hard time getting the water that you need. And these are the engines that we were actually bringing tenders into to try to increase the water supply with, okay, in order to make sure we could do what we needed to do. Let's talk about some of the challenges related to how did this community and how did we as public safety officials handle it. The scene extended, again, across the 2-block radius. We had approximately 40 homes that were being evacuated. And about the time that we thought we were going to get a handle on the fire, we would have either one of the mobile modular trailers or one of the trees, one of the surrounding debris that was mentioned in the video that would start on fire. So we had several instances where we would get a handle on the fire and then the fire would rear back up. And again, in part as well because of the winds that were blowing at the same time, okay? This just gives you a little bit of an idea about some of the winds. If you look real close, you can see the tree lines and that sort there as well. Here's some good pictures of what we were dealing with. The shrubs and the trees lit the houses on fire in this particular case. That is a 50-year-old oak tree that was on fire. Have any of you ever seen a tree start on fire? Do they move pretty quickly? They do, and they throw a lot of debris out. So it's a challenging issue. So we've got 90 firefighters. We've got 30-some-odd vehicles. What did that look like? And what do we as emergency managers, what do we as public safety responders, what's one of our first things that will go south if it's going to go south? Comms, right here, right? You guys can probably all understand. That was one of the things that we really struggled with as a part of our fire. I was actually the incident commander of the event, being the chief within the Tooele area. Several times, we were attempting to push people to different radio channels, but nobody could get where they needed to go, in part because of the speed, in part because of infrequent use of some of the other radio channels. But we had radio gridlock. Several times I just had to basically yell into the radio, you know what, clear the channel, because command has to communicate to the responders. Again, from a public safety standpoint, what's our first priority? Making sure all of the responders that are on scene go home safe every night, right? Life safety being the big one, property after that, okay? So we did. We had radio gridlock. We had staffing issues. Tooele City's department is a department of about 50. About 42 of those were on scene at the particular time, and then we proceeded to do the mutual aid request that caused us to get the other 9 departments on scene. Basically, we were looking at people and agencies pulling up, parking their vehicles, and going down to the vehicles that were in place and trying to take up and to relieve some of the crews that were on duty, okay? The 2 staging areas that we had, it's kind of unheard of in fire scenarios to actually need 2 staging areas, especially two staging areas 2 blocks apart. So very complicated scene. We have quite a passionate fire public safety community out there. We were basically having to tell firefighters that they couldn't go back to their post on the fire ground because they wanted to do everything within their power to try to prevent the fire from occurring. Have any of you ever been a part of evacuating any areas in your local communities? That can only, you'll have intermittent or moderate success in my experience trying to get that to occur. I actually had 40 homes that needed to be evacuated at the time. And once you evacuate people, you get them to a safe area, as you can see here in these pictures. We don't always get them to leave the area. So evacuated doesn't always mean that they're going to leave the area and get into a safe area. We had some forced evacuations, as much as you can possibly call them forced. As you can see, this individual, can you tell what surface he's on? He's on his own roof, yeah. And it was very difficult, obviously, to get him down because at this point, we had all hands on deck related to firefighters. We had officers actually having to tell him, you will come down now or you're going to go to jail. And it was a very difficult thing, especially out there for these folks to deal with, okay? Some of our challenges with our evacuees, we had 40 houses evacuated. Making sure that all those evacuees are accounted for. It took us quite a while into the event to make sure that everybody got out that needed to get out. We had people that got out with not much on their back. We had several that got out of the shower, had to be, blankets had to be put around them, and as they were making their way down the street, we had people going door to door, notifying everybody of what they were about to face and what needed to happen. So the roads were clogged with onlookers. This was kind of gridlock as well. You had fire units, and then you had people just standing around watching to see what was going to happen next, okay? Power and utility challenges. Can everybody see kind of the mix in my role at the time, where I've got my one fire chief hat on, and then I've got my emergency management hat on, how I'm starting to play back and forth. If it wasn't for an incredible staff that I tried to embarrass earlier today, and getting some of these challenges taken care of, we would have had much harder things, or much worse things happen. So I'm sitting there at the fire, I'm in my IC role, and I start to have transformers pop. And as transformers pop, we obviously, for anybody in the public safety world, you know that you need to make the area safe as best you can. So the power needed to be taken down. The transformers are popping, and we're starting to see electrical problems, and it just became necessary for us to completely take down the entire grid in that area of town. And I don't know in my entire career if I've ever had to take a complete grid down. But the problem that we experienced was when we took the grid down, we had our state refueling station that was right there in the middle of it. So we had to make some other things occur in order to make it to work out like we needed it to. Natural gas, we had some natural gas issues, obviously. Natural gas meters will burn off the side of the house. Then we've got methane just basically bleeding off. And one of the things that we have learned since then is that we need to make sure our firefighters understand that if the methane, the natural gas lines are burning, it is not necessarily a bad thing to leave them alone. We had some of our younger firefighters that were taking a lot of great pride in, yeah, I put out that fire. Did you see me put out that fire? Well, that wasn't necessarily what we wanted, because once the fire is out, the methane can cause other types of problems or hazards, okay? We had fiber optic lines that were damaged. Our utility response was incredible from our community. Full City was there right with us side by side. Public Works from the city really helped us out to kind of control and bring down roads as necessary. Rocky Mountain Power, Questar and Gas, CenturyLink were all very valuable partners as well. As you can probably imagine, All Call went out and all those folks responded as fast as they possibly could. So. And they were with us the entire way as we were going through kind of the recovery process of this. This is kind of one where I want to have some fun with y'all. If I got a little long there for a few minutes, just in trying to paint the picture of what we were dealing with, this is where I think you can understand some of our I guess, our giggles or our frustrations kind of at the same time. You got a big event that happens like this, and especially in the Tooele area, we have a couple of social media sources that really kind of can help us, but in the most part actually kind of haunt us. And I say that with a lot of respect to the individuals who have started this. So you've got this fire, it's raging on the one side of town, you've got half the community that's helping out at the fire, or thinks they're helping out at the fire, and then the other half of the community that wants to understand what can we do to help. Our social media channel, the #1 channel, the Tooele County 411, actually has about 20,000 followers to it. And we had some interesting things occur. We had people, how many of you got a scanner app on your phone? How many of you are not telling us the truth? How many actually have it but don't fess up to it? Okay, perfect. All right. And so we've got half of our Tooele community who wants to know what's going on. They want to put their nose in somebody else's business, so they've downloaded the scanner app, and they're listening to everything that's going on. Between the scanner app and the 411 in the Tooele Valley, we had some really interesting occurrences. We've got firefighters on there, to include myself, chief officer, saying we need water, because again, we had multiple fire trucks that were on the scene, and they were competing for the same water source. I have a lot of firefighter ease and a lot of firefighter slang that we don't sometimes remember. We've got others that don't understand, that are listening on the other side of the radio waves. So we were calling out for, we need water. And before we knew it, we turn around and we've got trucks rolling up to the edge of the evacuated area or the cordoned off area, dropping pallets, the equivalent of pallets of water, bottled water. We were wondering, where in the world did the bottled water come from? Who in their right mind? You know, we didn't ask for water. We're doing great, you know, clipping along, handling things like we need to. Come to find out, somewhere after the fact, that when the folks were listening to the social media channels, they took we need water as we need bottled water. And so once the event was actually over with, we actually had to figure out how we were going to get something down there to deal with the bottled water that was on scene at the same time. Firefighters were actually just interested in water in their hoses, okay? Just a typical common ease terminology that you'll find on any fire ground. But it was kind of a chuckle for us after it was all said and done, okay? We had another issue. Any of you hear about this on the media? A little bit of a controversy. Dry hydrants. That particular community had dry hydrants, okay? Firefighters use this term every so often as well. Dry hydrant doesn't necessarily mean, you know, all in all, that we had no water coming out of that particular hydrant. In our particular area, dry hydrant means that we don't get the flow that we're needing, okay? It's dry. Bring me another water source. So we had some interesting issues that came from this. And again, it was a competition factor of the units that were on scene trying to deal with it. Everyone see in the terms of JIC, GIS, all of those things in emergency management where we can try to help control what our social media, what our media sources are doing for us or against us, how beneficial it would have been. And unfortunately, because we were spread so thin, we didn't have the ability to really counteract this real quickly. So we were dealing with some of this between the bottled water that was showing up at the fire scene, bless their hearts, combined with the dry hydrant issues, okay? It became kind of an interesting time for us, all right? Oh, going the wrong direction. Here we go. This last one. We had people, okay, firefighters, another slang that we use. We need bodies. Anybody in the fire world ever said that on the radio? I need bodies down here. I need bodies over there. Well, for somebody in scanner land, that just meant something completely 180 degrees different for us, okay? For a period of time on the social media channels, we had people thinking, you know what, oh my Lord, there are dead bodies down there. And that was not the case. You know, they misinterpreted dead, you know, bodies, we need bodies, to mean dead bodies. And then after that, another aspect of the social media world took up that they needed people down there to help, that the firefighters were overwhelmed, overrun, and that they couldn't handle it anymore. But what did we get? We got people showing up in shorts and T-shirts with shovels, thinking that they were going to help put out the fire at the time. So a great, resilient community, well-intended community that's, you know, it's kind of a classic example of how you've got to have somebody sitting watching the media sources. And again, here's me, not with enough time as the incident commander, but the emergency management role where it starts to kick in and starts to watch this as well. Take a look at some of these posts. Okay, a couple things from emergency management, prayers and love, those kinds of things. Everyone seriously stay off Coleman and out of the area. Families are trying to evacuate. Can you see just kind of a cross-section of how the people were stepping in on the 411 to try to do what they could for us? So, social media, #1 rule, and again, if you can do this at all costs, try to monitor your social media. In hindsight, had the situation been different, and you know, we would have gotten this controlled faster than we were able to at the time, okay? Media. How many people in the room get to talk to the media? How many don't love to talk to the media, but get to talk to the media? Awesome. Yep, I've been, again, this comes back to, I'm one of the PIOs in the county. I'm the PIO for the department, fire department, kind of the PIO for the emergency management group as well. But how do you do that? Being the incident commander, being the emergency manager, and then being the PIO as well. It's a matter of transition as fast as you can. Again, it was a challenge. We acknowledge it was a challenge. So it was very difficult. We had media out there. Later that night, first thing in the morning, before we were ready, to actually let them in the scene, they were finding their way into the scene. Anybody ever had that experience before? Media just seems to find their way into the scene. They're looking over the fence. We love to see them looking over the fence with a fire hose in our hand, because we will typically cause them to run the other direction if they are in the wrong spot, okay? The 2-block area, how do you control the media in a 2-block area? We had law enforcement on every end of this post, but they were still able to find their way in, okay? How do you control them most of the time? Try to feed them, right? Try to give them something. Take them to a staging area, take them to a spot where they can get to. We were able to do this in time and try to get a handle on this, but it was very difficult to deal with. What were the first things that the media in this case wanted to know? They wanted to know when and how did the fire start, okay? Obviously they want to know that, okay? And then what was the dollar amount loss due to the fire? Very difficult for us to try to control, but during those first hours, we were doing our best to try to deal with the media, help them get what they needed from us. And again, I would caution you, if you don't even have the most experienced individual dealing with the media that can just help you wrangle them and try to keep them doing the things that we want them to do and we need them to do, that would be a wise thing to do. At this point in time, they were starting to also get the word that this was an intentionally set fire. So they really started to get ramped up to try to do a lot of investigative type reporting, and it became really interesting. You see myself, I'm actually did most of the interviews related to the event. Officer Turnbow, who was the other lead PIO for Twila City, were doing an interview. Any of you ever done an interview off the top of a garbage can? That's how fast and how interested the media were in trying to talk with us and get involved in this particular scene. So I actually had one of your big city garbage cans set up. It wasn't our ideal situation, but they had their mics all set up on it, and we were doing the interviews, and trying to accommodate them as much as we possibly could. In hindsight, getting control of this would have helped a great deal. Some of the challenges that we had is that they got, like I mentioned, the word that they were looking for suspects, and they were actually interested in information as fast as they could, and we did everything within our power, okay? Let me shift focus for you a little bit just away from the fire scene. We actually had some shelters set up. We had 2 that were set up on churches that, because of power outages, never did occur. We actually ended up setting up our West Elementary, one of our schools in the Twila area, as a shelter, and then we went with our ESF 6 partners and getting it staffed as fast as we could. Here's a little bit of an idea. Is it an ideal scenario for people to be bringing supplies down to a shelter in the initial stages of you setting it up? It's not in our best interest, not in their best interest, but as you can see, this is probably just less than 2 hours into the event. Once they learned, the community learned that they were going to start a shelter in this particular location. We had more of that bottled water than we knew what to do with, along with some other human needs, okay? A little bit of an idea as to what the shelter looked like. Obviously, the Red Cross partners are there with us as well. Some of our challenges with the shelters, like I mentioned, was that it moved because we needed it to move, but we felt comfortable being resilient and making it happen. One of our biggest issues that we dealt with was we had a lack of security in our shelters. There were no security-minded folks or experienced folks at the shelter at the time, so we had a lot of do-gooders that ended up. Any of you like to deal with the do-gooders? This is what we call them in the Twila area. They were very well-intended individuals. They were in trying to help us out as best they could, but they were a challenge to get a hold of. I was actually in the role where I had to come in, both with the fire chief role as well as the EM role, and tell these families, especially the 11 families that lost everything, that they had lost everything. If you've never had that experience before, it's probably one that I know I'll never want to have to deal with again. But with that, we had their neighbors, we had everybody there. You would think that it would be a support system for them, but it's not the ideal scenario. Many of the families wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to, they didn't want all of this extra things because they were getting emotional, and it was understandable, okay? Our initial reports to the families, this is actually a picture of some of the families that were affected. Fire had occurred at 10:42. It wasn't until about 4:30 that we had any word for them as to whether or not their homes were survived or not. We gave them a couple of different briefings. The first one at 4:30, second one at 7:15, 7:15, and then the third one at 9, okay? One of the issues that we had, challenges that we had, was controlling access to the media at the fire ground. It was very difficult to keep them around, like I'd mentioned. The medical units, once we decided, 9 o'clock was the hour that we decided that we would allow these individuals back into their scene. And it was a very emotional experience, as you can see, and if you've ever been involved in anything like this, having those individuals, the medical units, the mental health, and the clergy stage to try to help these folks because of the type of catastrophic loss that had occurred is very important. This particular victim did not get caught or chose not to go to the shelter. She comes back to the scene. She steps out of her vehicle and immediately goes down. She is very emotional at the time. She just found out that everything's gone. One of the challenges that we had in this particular case is trying to make sure that we had all of our victims at the shelter, or that we had a communication point with those victims to make sure they understood and knew what was happening. This is kind of an eye-opening one for you. Obviously, our onlookers or our do-gooders were walking around, and our first night we had 8 separate calls of looters going through their property, trying to, security was an issue for us just at the scene as well, okay? I'm going to move just quickly, kind of trying to monitor my time here, moving quickly. Damage assessments, our building inspectors were responsible for taking care of our damage assessments. Within the 24 hours, our first damage assessment totals were done. We knew that we were going to be high. Our initial totals were over $700,000 in total loss. If you think about doing a damage assessment, you ask yourself, well, that's not too hard to understand. That's a complete loss. But when we were doing the damage assessments, it became, sorry for flipping around on you, very apparent that more than just the total losses, we had to calculate anybody with a partial loss, anybody that might have experienced damage siding or anything like that as well, okay? Within the first 24 hours, we were dealing with volunteers. We've got a presentation going on in the other room about Team Rubicon. We had a couple different sets of groups that, the way we classified them, affiliated groups and unaffiliated groups that we were working with. We were fortunate out there to have Team Rubicon, the Southern Baptist, and the Home Depot crews coming in to help us out. Team Rubicon in and of itself ended up doing, I would say, the lead role in making sure that our debris removal took place. We had also a number of unaffiliated groups that were in as well. Okay, some of the challenges that we experienced with this, obviously with an affiliated response from volunteers, you've got to request assistance, you've got to figure out how to help take care of them, you got to get the equipment for them to use. Pretty similar to what the unaffiliated groups are going to need, with the exception of these folks are trained, okay? Team Rubicon was just tremendous. They were actually on their first response or deployment in Utah for us out at the Twilla fire. Unfortunately for them at the time, the fastest place for us to be able to help them get to in order to sleep and shower was our local Boys and Girls Club. They did it very happily. They brought with them all of their own equipment for feeding and supplies at the same time. One of our big benefits, one of our big bright spots related to the debris removal process and working with our volunteers in Twilla, we have what we call our TP3 program. It's our Twilla Public-Private Partnership Program. And we actually had to lean back on all of those folks that we have in the TP3 project in order to start our equipment and our resource inventory. These folks, you've got the Team the Southern Baptist in yellow there. You've got many of our partners, that are bringing the equipment in some of these other photos. Our most popular piece of equipment in the debris removal process was the Bobcat and the mini track. And then we started to go through piles like this. Okay, as you can see, pretty overwhelming amount of material to try to make your way through. As you can see, we're progressing into something similar to this. Our unaffiliated groups and volunteers were doing a very nice job as well, but they had their own set of challenges at the same time. We talk about Citizen Corps, we talk about CERT, One of the things that were really obvious to us with our unaffiliated volunteers was just how time intensive it was for us to try to track who was doing what, okay? If any of you ever seen the ash out operations occur? Know anything about ash out operations? That's one of the things that the affiliated volunteers bring with them. They have the ability to sort and sift. So not only can they use the equipment, but if you can provide that for them in a local community, they will do the sort and sift operations on your behalf. We had some success stories from the fire. We had wedding rings, ammunition cans full of money. We had heirloom handcuffs, family heirloom jewelry, and photos that were recovered as well. Out in the Twilla the Twilla landfill had some challenges at the same time. If you've ever had to remove 247 tons of debris that are fire-related debris, you've got to have a place to put it, right? So within the first 48 to 72 hours, we were actually clearing space out at our landfill, trying to separate the pile to be able to make sure that it got out there and disposed of quickly. We had to deal with a vouchering system to be able to get all of our different partners a way to get the waste out to the landfill in order to be able to move it as fast as we could. Supply donations, for any of you that have ever dealt with this before, some of our challenges were, we had an unbelievable response for supplies. People wanted to help out any way they could, but they wanted to bring it to you. And in our case, we didn't have the ability to take it at that point in time because of the different array of things. We had clothes, we had water, we had furniture, cars, trailers, we had mobile home trailers that people are wanting to donate. But it got to be quite a challenge telling them no, okay, or not now, okay? The magic of donations registries was really important to us at the time. Take a look at some of the kind of the array of things that were starting to fly in. There's a little bit of the idea of what the donations registry looked like, and that was our really only way to formulate how to keep track of all of these services. Many people got a little bit irritated with us as they would call in and we would say, thank you for your donation. We've got it on a registry, but we don't need it right now. Please keep it for now. In the first 24 hours, we had 2 telethons that had occurred, okay? We had, obviously, Fox 13, and we had KSL that had started telethons for these folks. The collections began about 1 p.m. on the 20th, so the very next day, we had nonprofit organizations along with Zions and others that were out getting support for these individuals at the same time, okay? Recovery meetings. Again, I know I'm moving kind of quick. It took a little bit longer than I'd hoped on my previous slides, but who's responsible for the disbursement of funds? So you got these telethons, they're coming in. How do we handle the money once it gets here? How many of you have a 501c3 in your community that can deal with something like this? Is it kept specifically for that purpose, or do you just blend it for other reasons? That's actually what we ended up doing. So it's a thought to think about. One of the other issues we had when the collection process began, we had the telethons that were collecting money for the victims of the Twilla fire, which is great. But what is the victim, in this case, of the fire? So we had an issue with this we had to deal with, okay? Is the victim somebody who had a total loss? Is the victim somebody who had a partial loss, who just had damage to their siding? Are they entitled to funds? Who decides whether or not they're entitled to funds? Okay, one of those challenges if you haven't dealt with before. We ended up establishing an advisory committee made up of the folks that you see there in order to come up with what was our definition. Our definition was that property owners were going to get 60% in a total loss and 40% would go to the occupant or the renter at the time. And a partial loss, 50-50. Okay? As you look through how do you deal with a problem like this, there is no magic formula for you to be able to use. So you pretty much pull together your resources to try to figure out what type of formula works best for everybody. The way that we did it, again, pardon me for flipping back and forth, was to use our government entities evolved with our community review board or committee in order to make sure that it happened, okay? And that we got the good definition that everybody wanted. Shortly thereafter, the first meeting occurred the following afternoon with the government representatives and the COAD groups. We had some challenges that were along with this. You notice the elected officials are highlighted in red. Please, going forward, if you ever have to deal with anything like this, make a place for the elected officials. That was one of our success stories. They were involved with us from the beginning, and that may seem silly to you, but it's important for them for a variety of reasons. Obviously they make budgets, they help us with finances. It was important. We had several of these types of community meetings that occurred just in order to make sure that things got coordinated, whether it was the Red Cross, whether it was emergency management folks that were trying to educate our community about the needs that were happening and to try to help get it organized. It was important for us, okay? Recovery meetings. This is one of our first recovery meetings. This was all of the victims in the room at the time. As you can see, yours truly is leading this particular group, but you have to understand something. Is you have victims and you're dealing with victims, and this is something we learned. They're all at different stages of grief, and one of my the few times that I've really almost been lynched was that meeting right there. They were mad. They were mad at everybody, and it didn't matter the reasons why or what I was trying to tell them. They were mad and they wanted answers, and many times they got answers, but they didn't necessarily like the answer they received, okay? Disbursement of funds. So back to that funding formula. What was that definition? We had the definitions were created. We had families that started to get funds that were available to them within probably the majority of the funds. It took at least 3 weeks for them to get them. Okay? GoFundMe. How many of you have ever contributed to a GoFundMe account? Okay? How many of you have ever administered a GoFundMe account? That I had to deal with that. What's one of the unwritten, hidden things in a GoFundMe account that you may not be aware of? The fees associated with that, okay? There's about $158,000 donated through the telethons to these victims, okay? Of which 13,000 were consumed in administrative fees. And so you have the media that is saying, you know what, 150,000, 140,000, and then they get their check, or then you begin to try to explain that to the community. And it's one of those things that people sometimes forget, one of those things that they may not be aware of. There are administrative fees anytime you call up and make a credit card donation, okay? And so that's got to come off the top to somebody. Another challenge that we had is we had several of these families that were using the money or needed the money 48 hours into the event because they had nothing, okay? They, you know, their bank accounts were dry, they had nothing, and some of them had a hard time understanding that when you have donated funds like this, when you charge against it, and this is again what the committee had decided, when you need the money, it comes out of your total portion. So they were thinking they were going to get 10,000, and they only got 8,000 because they'd already spent 2,000 of it because they'd already started drawing from it, okay? I know I've got just probably 3 or 4 minutes, right, Chris? About 3 minutes? Should be good. Again, apologies for trying to pull an extensive presentation and just to give you a feel for what this whole event looked like. So where are we at out there right now? We've got 4 out of the 11 homes that are in the process of rebuilding, okay, in that particular neighborhood. One of the challenges that we continue to have is they get asked and they get offered trailers that don't fit today's standards, or modular homes that don't fit today's standards. And it's a challenge for them because it's an easy way for them to get their home back, okay? And our building officials have to keep reminding them that, you know what, when you rebuild, and I know that, or you recover, I know many of you in the room understand this, you don't recover to 1978 standards when some of their trailers went into place. You recover to 2000, in this case, 16 standards. So they had a very hard time with that. One of the issues that we also had, in fact, we've been campaigning on it out in the Tooele area for a while now, is to know and to understand what your insurance looks like. You know, you've heard me talk about these 11 families. Many of them didn't have insurance, okay? Some of which, or if they did have insurance, they only had mortgage-related insurance, so they don't have to pay their mortgage anymore. They didn't have enough insurance to be able to rebuild, and so they're completely at the mercy of donations, loans, and those kinds of things. So we've had to, especially with these 11 families, start a little bit of an educational campaign on what does it look like to read your insurance policy. It's one of our success stories. This is one of, actually, Mr. Fuel, the first individual to get his home put back together, or put back a new home. He actually had tremendous insurance. We did have others that were not so fortunate. With our utility folks, our city folks, they were very helpful in making sure that this community recovers as fast as it can. I want to just draw to conclusion this again. What happened in this community? How did this event overall go off as well as it did, okay? And this is something that a couple challenges, couple conclusions for you. Relationships, okay? We as a community out there, we know our counterparts, brothers and sisters in the first response and emergency management role, tremendous relationships. So when that all call went out, everybody knew who they were dealing with. So I can't encourage you enough to get out to meet, if you don't currently know all the folks that you're serving with, either directly in your community or, you know, in your mutual aid partners, make sure that you do. Big one for you. Even though we plan, the speed of emergencies is increasing, causing us to react faster and in ways that we may not have planned for. So in this case, this was a weather event, okay? Partly because I say that, dry conditions, heavy winds. You know, if that wind wasn't pushing at 27 miles an hour or there's no wind, that's probably a grass fire. We're done and out of there in 30 minutes or less. But now we're into almost a year. Got to realize, especially in small communities, small towns, that people might be wearing different hats. I can't tell you. I've talked about some of my experiences with wearing multiple hats, but I have many counterparts that were doing the same thing. It's just kind of the nature of this profession. Recovery and rebuilding, these are elements that are unknown to the community, and they are success stories for us, partly because this is the way emergency management really got to promote itself in leading the recovery process. I think this one even bigger and better, or probably is the best one to summarize. For us, in emergency response, in public safety and emergency management, when meetings occur, when events happen, you got to be there. Don't feel like you don't have a place there. If you're in emergency management and you feel like, you know what, 98% of the time you guys are able to handle this problem, it's the 2% of the time when we get to get involved, you know what, I would make an argument for you that there is a place for you in that 98% of the time, you know, for the majority of those other emergencies. So don't miss your opportunities in getting out there, getting involved and being a part of the community. You'll never know when what seems to be a very small scale incident, maybe at the time, turns into be something that's, you know, a firestorm in our case, okay? Questions, anybody? I'm just 2 minutes over, but thank you for your patience with me trying to get through a lot of information. Hopefully this helps you understand more about what the Twilla fire entailed. So.
That was great. Thanks, Bucky. I think that obviously seeing 11 families that were impacted, but the thousands of people that were involved in that shows the resilience of a community, but also how small things can turn very large. We've got a gift here.